It was a suicide weapon, a project that failed in its very first battle, forcing Soviet soldiers to shoot their own dogs as they ran back to the trenches. But instead of writing this idea off as a monstrous mistake, it was turned into something even more terrifying. A system where a dog was trained to fear its handler more than an enemy tank. In this film, we will show how 18-year-old girls turned their best friends into living mines, and how a weapon the entire Wehrmacht laughed at became a personal nightmare for the Panzerwaffe. A weapon that, at the cost of unimaginable cruelty and broken lives, destroyed over 300 German tanks. In a system where death was programmed and success meant self-destruction, survival was impossible. Every handler, sending their dog into battle, said goodbye to it forever. It was a law, as immutable as the law of war. But sometimes, in the bloody chaos of battle, the impossible happened. A miracle occurred. His name was Buren, a large, shaggy dog of indeterminate breed, with intelligent and slightly sad eyes. His handler, a young boy named Alexei, loved him to distraction. He had taught Buren everything, and now, in a muddy trench near Oriol, he had to send him to his death. A German tank was crawling straight towards them, spewing fire. Alexei pulled the pin, whispered something into a shaggy ear, and slapped Buren on the back. "Go on, boy, go!" Buren ran, low and fast, just as he had been taught. Alexei squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the explosion. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Instead of a dull thud under the tank's hull, a sharp, deafening crack echoed from very close by. Alexei opened his eyes. The tank Buran had been running towards lurched and stopped, shrouded in smoke. Tongues of flame shot out from the turret. An anti-tank rifle crew, hidden in a nearby crater, had beaten him to it by a split second. The shell had hit the ammunition rack dead on. And Buren, stunned by the blast, was sitting in the snow about 10 meters from the burning vehicle, shaking his head in confusion. He didn't understand what had happened. The target was gone. The mission was canceled. He looked at the tank, then at the trench where his handler remained, and he ran back. When Alexei saw Buren running towards him, alive and unharmed, he froze for a moment. First thought, a misfire. The detonator failed. Second thought, sheer terror. He's running back here with a deadly payload. But the terror was instantly replaced by an irrational, all-consuming joy. Alive. He's alive. Buren leaped into the trench and began to lick his handler's face. The soldiers sitting nearby first recoiled, but then, realizing there would be no explosion, they gathered around them. Alexei wept, unashamed of his tears, hugging the dog's shaggy neck. He stroked him, felt him over, as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. A sapper was called. An old, mustached man, without saying a word, carefully unbuckled the straps on the pack. He examined the mechanism for a long time, then handed Alexei the detonator pin. It was bent almost in half. A stray piece of shrapnel from the tank's explosion had struck it, deforming it, but not activating it. Another 1 in a million chance. Another impossible stroke of luck in the lottery of war. News of Buren's survival spread throughout the battalion. Soldiers came to look at him as if he were a curiosity. They brought him their rations, lumps of sugar, crusts of bread. He was no longer just a dog. He had become a symbol, a talisman. If a suicide dog could come back alive from such a hell, then they had a chance too. It meant God himself had saved him. It meant they could survive too. The commander, instead of sending Buren into the next battle, ordered him to be kept at headquarters. For the rest of the war, Buren lived there, greeting and seeing off soldiers with a lazy wag of his tail. he became a living legend, a reminder that even in the most inhumane system, built on certain death, there is sometimes room for a miracle. A small, shaggy, incredible miracle that offered hope where it seemed none was left. War is a learning process, cruel, bloody, but inevitable. Each side learns from its enemy, and the Wehrmacht, which went from mocking the dog weapon to panicked screams over the radio, learned as well. Their attitude towards the anti-tank dogs evolved from contempt to hatred, and from hatred to something new, to a grim, reluctant respect. An NKVD interrogator's office. A dim lamp pulls two faces from the gloom. The tired, impassive face of a Soviet captain and the face of a captured German officer. An Oberleutnant, a tank company commander, an aristocrat with fine features and a steel, unbroken gaze. The interrogation has been going on for hours. They talk of tactics, numbers, the weak spots in the new Panther's armor. And at some point, the captain, more out of curiosity than protocol, asks a question. What do you think of our demolition dogs? The Oberleutnant falls silent for a moment. His gaze becomes distant, as if he's looking through the wall, back to the battlefield. He slowly chooses his words. At first, he says in Russian, with a heavy accent, we laughed. We thought it was the desperation of savages, Asiatic barbarism, as our leaflets called it. It seemed absurd, not serious, unworthy of a soldier. He pauses, remembering. Then we grew to hate them. When I first saw a small dog blow the track off my best cruise tank, it wasn't rage, it was disgust. It was dirty, wrong. War is a duel of steel, a duel of will. But this was something from the underworld. The interrogator listens in silence, not interrupting. He can see this isn't propaganda. The prisoner is speaking sincerely. We learned to fear them, the German continues. Every bush, every crater could hide this threat. We started burning everything in front of us. We wasted shells and fuel to clear 50 meters of space ahead of the tanks. This weapon slowed us down. It got on our nerves. It made us make mistakes. The Oberleutnant raises his eyes to the captain, and in his gaze there is no longer contempt or hatred, only a cold, heavy weariness. And then I understood, he says quietly. I understood that this isn't barbarism, nor savagery. It is total war. You Russians, you don't fight the way we do. We fight with an army. You fight with your entire nation, with everything you have. You throw everything into the fight, men, women, children, and even your dogs. You are willing to sacrifice everything and everyone for victory. He leans back in his chair, and that inspires. He searches for the word again, both disgust and respect. Respect for such desperation, for such a will to resist. We are not just fighting an army. We are fighting a country that is willing to sacrifice its own soul to survive, to defeat such a people. He shakes his head. To defeat such a people will be incredibly difficult. Silence fell in the small, smoke-filled office. The Soviet interrogator looked at his enemy, and for the first time saw not just a prisoner, but a man who understood the very essence of this war. He understood that the anti-tank dogs were not just a tactical method. They were a symbol of a war without rules, without pity, without limits. A war in which anything that could harm the enemy was used for the sake of victory. And this fear, mixed with respect in the enemy's eyes, was also a weapon, perhaps one of the most effective. The system was merciless. The order was absolute. The war demanded sacrifice. But a man, even a cog in the vast military machine, always looks for a way to cheat the system, especially when a friend's life is on the line. And there, on the front lines, amidst the fire and death, not only tragedy was born, but also a legend. The legend of a soldier's ingenuity. His name was Jack, a brilliant dog, a mix of German shepherd and some forest stray. His handler, a Siberian named Yegor, was a man of few words, but stubborn. He loved his dog with that silent, strong love that only strong people are capable of, and the thought that he would have to send Jack to his certain death was unbearable for him. While other instructors were honing the dog's unconditional one-way run reflex, Yegor secretly, at night, taught Jack something different. He fashioned a dummy mine from a duffel bag and sticks, and for hours, in a whisper, he would repeat the same command, accompanying it with a gesture and a piece of sugar. A command that wasn't in any manual. He taught Jack to run up to a model tank, dive under it, and then, pulling a specially sewn strap with his teeth, drop the mine and immediately return. It was almost a circus act, an incredibly complex trick for an animal under stress. But Jack was a smart one, and Yegor was patient. He believed, we will cheat the war. And then their day came. Their company was thrown in to plug a gap in the defenses. German tanks were coming in a wave. The commander, seeing Yegor fussing with his dog, shouted, "Siberian, what are you waiting for? Let him go." Yegor pulled the pin. He leaned down to Jack. "Go on, buddy, just like we practiced. Go." And Jack ran. Everyone in the trench held their breath. They were waiting for the explosion. But there was none. The dog reached the lead tank, darted under the tracks, and popped out on the other side, empty, without the deadly backpack, and he bolted back towards the trench at full speed. "Traitor! Cowardly beast!" someone nearby screamed. The commander was already raising his rifle to shoot the dog as unwritten instructions demanded. But at that moment, an explosion roared. The German tank lurched, tilted, and stopped dead. The mine, left by Jack precisely under the drive sprocket, had worked. Jack, having already reached the trench, jumped in and joyfully nudged Yegor's hand with his wet nose. A dead silence fell over the trench. Everyone stared, first at the smoking tank, then at the live, tail-wagging dog, then at the Siberian's calm face. The commander slowly lowered his rifle. He walked over to Yegor. His face was unreadable. For such insubordination, for violating every conceivable and inconceivable order, the punishment was a court-martial, a firing squad. He looked at Yegor for a long, hard time. Then he shifted his gaze to the result, the knocked-out Panzer that had blocked the road for the entire column. He turned, silently reached into his duffel bag, pulled out a can of American Lend-Lease stew, the greatest treasure on the front line, and handed it to Yegor. "Feed your magician," was all he said, and he continued down the trench, giving orders. This story, of course, sounds like a front-line tale. Perhaps the soldiers made it up to preserve a grain of hope, to believe that even in this meat grinder, one could remain human, that it was possible to both follow an order and save someone you care about. But every legend is born from truth, and the truth was that the Russian soldier, even in the face of certain death, always looked for his own third way, a way where daring ingenuity and love proved stronger than the cruelest order. 1944. The war was rolling westward. The roar of the cannons was no longer heard near Moscow, but near Warsaw and Budapest. The Red Army had changed. It was no longer the retreating, bleeding army of 41. It had become a powerful, experienced, well-armed machine for victory. And in the clang of its tracks and the thunder of its guns, the weapon of desperation was becoming unnecessary. Its time was passing. In the rear training centers, where the spirit of merciless drill had recently reigned, something had subtly changed. The dogs were no longer starved. They were no longer beaten for the slightest offense. Instead of roaring tank engines, other sounds were now heard on the training grounds: the quiet click of a mine detonator, the calm commands of an instructor, the joyful bark of a dog that had found a training charge. The anti-tank dog program was not canceled by a loud order. It simply faded away, quietly, imperceptibly, without ceremonial formations or farewell salutes, like a fire that dies out when no more wood is added. The reason was simple and pragmatic: the economics of war. A flood of new, far more effective anti-tank weaponry was pouring into the front. The legendary PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles were now in every rifle squad. Handheld-shaped charge grenades capable of burning through a tiger's armor had appeared. Bazookas flowed in a river from America through Lend-Lease, and their own homegrown artillery had learned to hit targets precisely with sub-caliber shells. Against this arsenal, a dog with 12 kilograms of TNT on its back looked like an anachronism, a relic of that terrible era when gaps in the defense had to be plugged literally with their own bodies and the bodies of their animals. The quartermaster at the front headquarters, filling out a requisition for reinforcements, now wrote, PTRS, 100 units, ammunition load, 5,000 rounds, instead of anti-tank dog squad, 50 units. It was more effective, more reliable, more predictable. A bullet, unlike a dog, would not get scared. A shell would not run back. A new fate awaited the remaining dogs and their instructors. They began to be retrained en masse. Those who were created to bring death were now meant to save lives. Their keen sense of smell, which was previously supposed to detect the scent of an enemy tank, was now being tuned to the smell of explosives. They became mine detectors. They crawled ahead of the advancing infantry, finding and marking the deadly surprises left by the Germans. Every landmine they found meant dozens of saved lives. Others were retrained as signal dogs. They ran with messages under fire where a man could not crawl and a wire would break. A third group became medics, carrying packs of medical supplies and dragging the wounded from the battlefield. The dog was returning to its true nature. It was once again becoming a helper, a friend, a savior. It was no longer forced to be a suicide bomber. Analysts from German intelligence also noticed these changes. The term Hundeminen appeared less and less frequently in their reports. The enemy has practically abandoned the use of demolition dogs, they stated. It seems they have placed their bet on standard anti-tank weapons. The program's decline was quiet and natural. It was born in the fire of retreat, reached its bloody peak in the great turning point battles, and quietly faded in the rays of the approaching victory. A terrible, cruel, and controversial page of military history had been turned. But for those who had written their names and the names of their pets into it, this war was not over. It was just beginning. May of '45, Berlin had fallen. The last salvos had faded. The world, mad with joy, celebrated victory. Soldiers were returning home. Heroes, victors. They traveled in cattle cars, covered in medals, dreaming of a peaceful life, of bread, of silence. But among them were those who carried an invisible burden, those for whom the war did not end with the last shot. It had taken up permanent residence inside them. Nina Ipatova, the same 18-year-old girl who had once said goodbye to her German shepherd, Julba, returned to her native village. She had survived. She had made it through the entire war. She had been wounded, shell-shocked, but she had survived. They greeted her as a hero. They hugged her, they cried with happiness. But she looked at it all with a slight detachment, as if through thick glass. In the evening, at the celebratory table, when everyone was singing songs and raising toasts to victory, to Stalin, to the fallen, she sat in silence. Everyone was rejoicing, but she could only see one thing: Julba's eyes, that very last look, full of trust, at the moment she pulled the pin and gave the command, "Go." She replayed the scene in her mind over and over: how he ran, how the explosion engulfed him, how only a dark, ragged stain was left on the snow. This victory had cost her a piece of her soul. The creators of the program, the high-ranking commanders and scientists, also tried to move on. Colonel Medvedev continued to head the Red Star School, but now he developed exclusively peaceful military specialties for dogs. Kinologist Alexander Mazover became one of the country's leading experts, writing dozens of books on breeds, training, and animal psychology. But in his later works, in his official biography, there were only a few dry official lines about anti-tank dogs, as if he were trying to erase this chapter from his life, as if he were ashamed, as if he, the creator of the method, carried the guilt for the rest of his days for those he had taught to trust a person sending them to their death. And the ordinary handlers, their trauma was different, deeper, more personal. One day, a neighbor's boy ran up to Nina, joyfully dragging a small, floppy-eared puppy behind him. "Aunt Nina, look at him. Let's teach him commands, you know how." Nina looked at the puppy. It trustingly nudged her hand with its wet nose, and she snatched her hand back as if from a fire. She couldn't. She physically could not. Her hand wouldn't rise to give the command sit or lie down. Her voice wouldn't obey, because every command echoed in her memory with the ghost of that last one, the one that had cost a life. She was never able to get a dog again. For the rest of the world, the war was over. The heroes had returned home. They needed to build a new life, rebuild cities, raise children. They needed to forget the horrors of the past. And this page of history, uncomfortable, cruel, unheroic, was forgotten the fastest. It didn't fit into the grand portrait of the great victory. But for those who had lived through it, forgetting was impossible. The scars on their souls did not heal. They carried this memory within them, like a piece of shrapnel. A memory of loyalty turned into a weapon. A memory of friendship sacrificed. A memory of the last look in faithful canine eyes. And this silent war inside them continued until the very end. Time is the best healer, and the most ruthless censor. It erases from memory the things that are painful to remember. It hides the inconvenient, cruel pages of history in the farthest archives, leaving only the ceremonial, glossy cover on display. And the story of the anti-tank dogs became one of those pages. On Poklanaya Hill in Moscow, among the monuments dedicated to great battles and celebrated armies, stands one that is almost unnoticed. A bronze dog, a German shepherd, its ears pinned back warily. On its back, a pack. That same pack, the deadly one. It has no name, no rank. There isn't even an epitaph on the pedestal. Just the figure of a dog, frozen in an eternal wait for a command. It stands there, in the very heart of the Victory Memorial, like a silent memory, a mute reproach. After the war, they tried not to speak of them. Their feet did not fit into the heroic saga. How do you tell children, in a lesson on courage, that their grandfathers sent their loyal dogs to their deaths? How do you write into the grand chronicle of victory the story of having to kill your own, most loyal friends as they ran back to the trenches? It was too complex, too painful a truth, and they chose to forget it. In the memoirs of marshals, you won't find chapters dedicated to the dog battalions, In war films, you won't see scenes of a female instructor saying goodbye to her companion. History preserved the memory of the feats of pilots, tankers, infantrymen, and partisans, and the dog destroyers were reduced to a historical curiosity, a footnote in small print in thick academic volumes, a dead-end branch of military thought born of desperation. For the modern historian, this is a terrible but important symptom of total war, proof of the sacrifices and the cruelty a person is capable of when cornered, a tragedy that is important to remember in order to understand the true, unceremonious price of victory. But for the average person strolling through the park today, this story sounds like fiction. Suicide dogs? Never heard of them. Is that even possible? It sounds like a myth, like a grim fairy tale. The truth has become so distant and incredible that it's hard to believe. The oblivion was almost complete, and only this bronze figure on Poklonaya Hill continues to stand. Cold metal, preserving the memory of what was once alive, warm, devoted, of fur that smelled of gunpowder and fear, of a wet nose nudging a frozen palm, of eyes full of boundless trust. It stands there alone, for all of them, for Rex and Alma, for Julba and Burin, for the thousands of nameless mongrels and shepherds whose feat was as immense as it was unnoticed. A silent monument to the thousands who stepped into eternity, leaving nothing behind but this cold metal and our memory. 1935, the Moscow region, the Red Star Central Military Technical School of Service Dog Breeding. The air smells of decaying leaves, gunpowder, and dog fur. Alexander Pavlovich Mazover, the country's best cynologist, watches the culmination of months of work. He is not a military man at heart. He is a scientist, an intellectual who believes in the power of science and the limitless intelligence of an animal. His best dog, a shepherd named Rex, awaits the command. The dog's eyes are fixed on his master. In them, absolute, boundless trust. In the distance, a T-26 training tank clanks its tracks. A short gesture, and Rex explodes from his spot. He doesn't run. He flies over the ground. Low, swift, a single impulse of muscle and will. The cadets watching the test freeze. The dog pays no attention to the roar of the engine. It is not afraid of the steel behemoth. For the dog, this roar is a promise, the promise of food. The dog dives under the tank's hull. A second later, and it's already running out the other side, wagging its tail. The task is completed perfectly. The cadets erupt in applause. They see a triumph. A new weapon, brilliant in its simplicity, has been born. But Mazover does not smile. He slowly turns away, so no one can see his face. He, the creator of this method, sees something else entirely. He sees how he has just turned a dog's highest virtue, its loyalty, into a mechanism for killing. He has taught it to trust the man who will send it to its death. In the 30s, the world was preparing for a war of engines. The general staffs of all the world's armies were drawing swift arrows of tank wedges on their maps. Armor was getting thicker, cannons more powerful. The tank was becoming an absolute weapon, the invincible god of the battlefield. And in the Soviet Union, acutely aware of its technological lag, they were searching for an asymmetric response, an answer that wouldn't require complex factories, expensive steel, or long years of training for engineers. The answer had to be simple, cheap, and mass-producible. The idea, born within the walls of Red Star, seemed flawless, almost elegant. It was based not on metallurgy, but on biology, on the great teachings of academician Pavlov about conditioned reflexes. The logic was brutally simple. If you keep a dog half-starved and only give it food in one specific place, it will strive to get there, ignoring any danger. And that place was to be the tank's most vulnerable area, its underbelly. Thus began the development of a weapon with no equal in the world. Thousands of dogs from all over the Union, purebred shepherds from Osso Aviacum clubs, and common mutts requisitioned from the populace, became raw material for the new war machine. For months, they were conditioned to one simple rule. The clank of tracks and the roar of an engine was a signal that a bowl of meat awaited them under the armored behemoth. Hunger had to be stronger than fear. A pack was strapped to the dog's back, 12 kilograms of TNT, enough to rip apart a track, break through the thin armor of the underbelly, and turn a formidable fighting machine into a motionless pile of metal. And on top, sticking out of the pack, was a 20-centimeter wooden pin. The detonator. Primitive, but reliable. When the dog dove under the tank, the pin would press against the hull, tilt, and trigger the explosion. For the Red Army Command, this was a weapon of the future, a self-guided mine, capable of finding its own target and striking it in its most vulnerable spot. The cost of training one dog was incomparably lower than the cost of one anti-tank gun. And while Germany's Krupp factories were producing hundreds of tanks, Soviet kennels could produce thousands of living projectiles. Meanwhile, in Berlin, in the Wehrmacht headquarters, they were drawing up plans for the perfect war, the Blitzkrieg. Their tactics were built on impeccable logic, on the interaction of tanks and aircraft, on discipline and technological superiority. The thought that they might be met not with steel, but with flesh and blood, not with cannons, but with fangs and loyalty, simply never entered their minds. The concept of a mine dog was beyond their understanding of the art of war, beyond their imagination. They were preparing to meet soldiers on the battlefield. They were not prepared to meet phantoms born of desperation. Alexander Mazover looked at his charges. They were perfect, intelligent, obedient, devoted. He and others like him, the country's best sinologists, had carried out their orders. They had created a weapon based on love and trust. And soon, this weapon was about to step into the fire for the first time. None of them yet knew that the theory, so flawless on the quiet training grounds near Moscow, would collide with reality. And that reality would prove more terrifying than any calculation. The system, born in the silence of offices and on the blueprints of strategists, gained a soul on the training grounds. And this soul was very young. The instructors, the guides of these suicide squads, were not hardened veterans, but yesterday's schoolgirls, girls who had just turned 18, 19. They came from ordinary Soviet towns and villages, full of desire to defend the motherland, and they were handed not a rifle, but a leash. Their task was to turn a living, loving creature into a weapon. But war is always a paradox. To create the perfect weapon, they had to become its best friend. The night before being sent to the front, Corporal Nina Ipatova sits on the floor of a cold kennel. Beside her, with his heavy head on her lap, lies her shepherd, Julba. The air is thick with the smell of wet dog, hay, and unshed tears. At dawn tomorrow, they will be loaded onto a train that will take them west, into the roar and the flame, into their first and last battle. Nina doesn't say a word. She just brushes his fur. The stiff brush scrapes through his thick black coat, again and again. A monotonous, soothing motion. She tries to memorize every detail, the feeling of the warm, living body under her hand, the intelligent brown eyes that follow her every move, the way he sighs trustingly in his sleep. 6 months ago, he was just dog number 42 to her. An assignment, a combat unit. She taught him not to fear gunshots, to to crawl on his belly, to find the coveted bowl under a roaring tank. She was strict. She starved him to make the reflex flawless. The regulations demanded it. Colonel Medvedev demanded it. But day by day, week by week, the regulations gave way to life. Dog number 42 became Julba, an intelligent, devoted friend who greeted her with a joyful bark, who could understand a command from a single glance, who licked the salty drops from her cheeks when she cried from exhaustion and despair. A bond formed between them, deep, silent, absolute, the kind of bond that can only exist between a person and their dog. And this bond was part of the deadly mechanism. The more Julba loved Nina, the more he trusted her, the more precisely he would carry out her final order. She had to become his entire world, so that later, at the decisive moment, that world could point him toward a fiery death under the tracks of an enemy tank. Somewhere far away, at the station, a steam engine lets out a long whistle, a signal of their imminent separation. Nina buries her face in his fur. She remembers the lines from a letter she just sent to a friend. He's so smart. He understands everything. Sometimes I think he knows where we're going. He looks at me with such eyes. It breaks my heart. She has no right to pity him. She is a soldier. But now, in the silence of the last peaceful night, she is just an 18-year-old girl saying goodbye to her best friend. And 1,000 kilometers away, in a muddy trench near Smolensk, a German tanker named Hans is cleaning the machine gun of his Panzer. He's thinking about the Russian frost, the impassable mud, the anti-tank rifles they'd nicknamed knockers. He is preparing to face steel, fire, the desperate but predictable fury of the enemy infantry. His world consists of calibers, armor thickness, and offensive maps. He, a professional soldier in a great army, cannot even imagine that his main enemy will soon be not a cannon or a shell, but a small, dark dot hurtling across a snow-covered field, a dot in whose eyes there is boundless devotion to one young girl. Summer, 1941, the Southwestern Front. The earth is dry and hot, like ash. A thick, heavy hum hangs in the air. It's not thunder. It's the tanks. A soldier, Ivan Lysenko, sits in a shallow trench, pressing himself into the dusty parapet. He isn't scared. He's curious. Because today, he is supposed to see a miracle. For several days, they've been told about a new secret weapon, about four-legged armor piercers that will stop the German panzers. He looks at the handlers, pale young men stroking their dogs, and feels hope swelling in his chest. There it is, our answer. Simple and ingenious. On the horizon, the black boxes of German tanks appear. They crawl forward relentlessly, raising columns of dust behind them. The commander, glued to his binoculars, drops a short, sharp command. Release them. And the miracle begins. 30 living torpedoes, 30 trained destroyers, break free from their leashes. They race across the scorched field, hugging the ground. For a moment, a triumphant silence falls over the trench. The soldiers watch, holding their breath, as their loyal assistants fly towards the steel armada. But something goes wrong. Halfway there, the dogs suddenly slow their pace. They stop. They spin in place, whining in confusion. Their world, built on reflex, collapses in an instant. The scent was wrong. For 6 months, they had been taught that food smelled like diesel fuel, like their own T-26 and T-34 tanks. But these black boxes smelled of gasoline. Sharp, foreign, wrong. Instinct, stronger than any training, screamed at them. This is foreign. This is danger. And where is safety? Safety is where the familiar scent is, where their handlers are, where, behind the hill, their own familiar diesel tanks are hidden. And so they ran. Back. Ivan Lysenko can't believe his eyes. The hope in his chest gives way to bewilderment, and then to icy horror. The dogs, their wonder weapon, have turned around and are running back, towards them, straight into the trenches, on each of their backs, 12 kilograms of TNT, armed and ready. The commander was the first to recognize the disaster. His face contorted. He screamed, his voice breaking. "Back! Drive them back!" But it was too late. The loyal animals, seeking protection from their masters, were already closing in. And then came the most terrible order one could ever hear. "Fire! On the dogs! Fire!" All hell broke loose in their own trenches. The soldiers, who a minute ago had watched the dogs with hope, were now firing at them in a panic. Rifles fired at living targets that were carrying death to their own side. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter, a betrayal. But who had betrayed whom? It was impossible to tell. Meanwhile, inside the lead panzer, the German gunner, Klaus, watched the completely surreal scene through the narrow slit of his viewport. He saw the Russians release a pack of dogs. He saw them run around the field. And then the Russians themselves started shooting at them. "What kind of circus is this?" he asked his commander. "Looks like they've all gone mad over there," the tank commander boomed in reply, without looking away from his sights. The crew laughed nervously. Some kind of wild Asiatic army, a primitive, absurd enemy that destroys itself before the battle even begins. They didn't even realize it was a weapon aimed at them. To them, it was merely proof of the complete chaos reigning in the Red Army. The first battle wasn't just a failure. It was a catastrophe. A verdict. The theory, so neat on paper, had shattered against a simple chemical formula. The difference between diesel and gasoline had cost dozens of lives and the broken morale of an entire unit. The naive hope in a wonder weapon died that summer day, shot down by its own creators in dusty trenches, to the deafening laughter of the enemy. The failure on the battlefield gave birth to a monster. It wasn't born in headquarters or in design bureaus. It was born right here, in the trenches, in the eyes of soldiers facing the most terrible consequence of the mistake, the necessity of killing those they had tamed. The handler, Pyotr Semyonov, lies pressed against the earth. The ground is shaking. Mortars are striking somewhere nearby. But he doesn't hear them. He sees only his dog, Alma, a mongrel, the smartest of her entire litter. He had chosen her himself for her cleverness and bravery. He had shared his rations with her. He had taught her everything he knew. And now, the time has come. He points to the lead German tank, a short pat on the back, the command, "Go." And Alma, just as she was taught, bolts from her spot, a black lightning bolt flying over the withered grass. Pyotr follows her with his eyes, full of hope and fear. "Make it. Please, make it." She's almost there. 100 meters, 50. But war is a lottery of shrapnel. One piece, a random one, torn from the earth by a nearby explosion, slashes her hind leg. Alma yelped, a piercing, childlike sound, and fell onto her side. The tank crawled past, not noticing her. Pyotr sees her trying to get up. She rises on 3 legs and, dragging the 4th, limps back, towards him. There was nothing in her eyes but pain and confusion. She was looking for salvation from her master, from her God. She crawled towards him, leaving a thin, bloody trail behind her. And on her back, a mechanism was ticking, ready to detonate at any moment from an awkward movement. Pyotr screamed, not hearing his own voice. "Go back, Alma! Back!" But she didn't listen. She saw only him, her person, her salvation. Lying next to Pyotr was the platoon commander, a young lieutenant, his face gray with dirt and tension. He didn't see a wounded dog. He saw 12 kilograms of TNT crawling towards a trench holding 24 men. He grabbed Pyotr by the shoulder, his fingers digging in like pincers. "Shoot! Semyonov, shoot! God damn it!" But Pyotr couldn't. His hands, holding the rifle, had turned to stone. His entire being screamed, "No!" This was his Alma. He couldn't shoot into those eyes that looked at him with boundless trust. The lieutenant understood everything. He didn't say another word. He simply tore the rifle from Pyotr's numb hands. He raised it to his shoulder. A shot rang out, short, dry, businesslike. Alma twitched and fell still. Her eyes remained open, fixed on the trench where her master sat. For 3 days after that, Pyotr Semyonov couldn't speak. He followed orders, ate, cleaned his weapon, but did not utter a sound. Something inside his world had broken, irreparably. And on the German side, an observer with binoculars recorded the episode in his log. Enemy is disorganized. Soldiers are shooting their own dogs. Their morale is broken. For him, it was just another detail in the picture of a decaying enemy army. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a tactical sign. The order to destroy returning dogs wasn't written in any manual. It was born on its own, from the bloody logic of battle, and it was impossible to follow. It demanded more from a soldier than just killing an enemy. It demanded he kill a friend to save his comrades. It demanded he sacrifice a part of his soul. This was the price for a mistake made far behind the lines. A price paid not by generals, but by ordinary guys like Pyotr Semyonov, who watched their commanders kill their dogs before their very eyes. Or, what was even more terrifying, they had to do it themselves. This order turned soldiers into executioners, and the trench into a place where not only hope, but humanity went to die. In any other army in the world, the catastrophe of the first battle would have put an end to the program. It would have been deemed a monstrous mistake, a costly and ineffective curiosity. The remaining dogs would have been decommissioned, and the engineers responsible would have been court-martialed. But this was the Red Army of 1941, an army that could not afford the luxury of admitting mistakes, especially when there was nowhere left to retreat. Failure did not lead to cancellation. It led to a hardening. 1942, the snow-covered training grounds of the Red Star School. The frost is so bitter, the metal burns the skin. Colonel Grigory Panteleimonovich Medvedev stands, oblivious to the cold. His face, weather-beaten and stern, looks as if it were carved from granite. He watches the training of a new intake. Young instructors are herding the dogs towards the roaring, belching tanks. But something has changed. The atmosphere is different. The last drop of warmth has vanished from it. Medvedev sees the dogs still huddling against the handler's legs. They seek protection. They trust. And it is precisely this that he now sees as the root of all failures. Trust, affection, love. On the front line, these feelings turned into weakness. They made the dogs run back to the protection of their master. They prevented the soldier from pulling the trigger when necessary. He approaches a group of instructors. These are no longer the naive girls of 41. Their gazes have become harder, their movements sharper. The war has burned the sentimentality out of them. Medvedev sweeps them with a heavy gaze and utters a phrase that became the new, merciless philosophy, the fatal motto of the entire program. Remember, the dog must fear the trainer more than the tank. In the silence of the frosty morning, these words sound like a death sentence. No more petting or words of encouragement. Only harsh discipline. Only hunger and fear. Now, the instructor's task is not to be a friend to the dog. The task is to become a force more terrifying and inescapable than the roar of battle, the fire of machine guns, and even death itself. The dog must run forward, not because there is food there, and not because it trusts its master. It must run forward because staying by his side is even more terrifying. The training methodology changes. Now, the tanks on the training grounds don't just drive around. They fire blanks. Simulated charges explode all around. The dogs are being conditioned to hell, and any that tries to take cover or run away gets a blow. A cruel, painful one. The master, who just yesterday was a source of affection, becomes a source of pain. It was a breaking of the will. There was only one goal. A new iron chain of thought had to be forged in the animal's brain. The tank is terrifying, but the handler is more terrifying. The only path to salvation is to run away from him, into the fire. And this inhuman logic began to yield results. The dogs stopped coming back. They ran forward with the desperation of the doomed. They raced towards the target because the path back was closed to them, closed by the fear of the one they once loved. The Soviet command did not see cruelty in this. They saw effectiveness. The system didn't fail, they decided. The execution was flawed. We will make it work, at any cost. With German tank spearheads pushing towards the Volga and Moscow at their backs, the cost no longer mattered. There was nowhere left to retreat. Meanwhile, reports started reaching German intelligence headquarters on the Eastern Front. Strange, disturbing reports. The Russians, despite obvious failures, are continuing to use their dogs. But now, they are operating differently, more aggressively, more effectively. The weapon the entire Wehrmacht had laughed at had mutated. It was transforming from a curiosity into a real, albeit localized, threat. The order was given: treat this tactic with the utmost seriousness. The iron will of the Soviet command had collided with the pragmatism of the German war machine, and this clash had only just begun. 1942. The Eastern Front. German tanker Hans von Luck sits on the armor of his Panzer, trying to warm his frozen fingers on a mug of ersatz coffee. The war had devolved into a viscous, dirty routine. But recently, something new had appeared in this routine. Something irrational. He first saw it a week ago. Their column was moving along a muddy road when 3 dark shadows darted out from the roadside forest. They didn't look like infantrymen. They were too fast, too low to the ground. The machine gunner on the turret reacted instantly, spraying the suspicious movement with lead. 2 of the shadows fell, but the third one got through. Hans saw it at the last moment. An ordinary mongrel with some kind of hump on its back. It dove under the neighboring tank. The explosion wasn't deafening, like from a shell, but a dull, tearing sound, as if a giant hammer had struck the armor from beneath the earth. Lieutenant Schmidt's tank jerked, listed to one side, and stopped, shrouded in black smoke. The track had been blown to shreds. Since then, the tension among the crews had not subsided. The weapon they had laughed at a year ago was back, and it was different, more vicious, more effective. The Russians had changed their tactics. They no longer sent dogs in frontal assaults across open ground. Now, they operated from ambushes, from the forests, from the ruins of villages, from deep ravines. They let the tanks get almost on top of them, to 100 or even 50 meters, and only then did they release their living mines. There was almost no chance to react. A new word appeared in German staff documents: Hundeminen, dog mines. The derogatory nickname quickly became an official term. General Hoth, commander of the tank group, issued a special directive that was read aloud to every crew. To all units on the Eastern Front, upon sighting any dogs in the combat zone, open fire to kill immediately. Every dog is to be considered a potential inhumane. The war turned into a hunt. Tankers, whose job was to destroy armored vehicles and artillery, now scanned every bush, every crater, looking not for the glint of optics, but for movement in the undergrowth. The hull machine guns, which used to stay silent until direct contact with infantry, now chattered non-stop, combing the terrain ahead of the column. Ammunition expenditure doubled. The pace of the advance slowed. Hans von Luck wrote in his diary, "We have encountered fanatical resistance. They are throwing dogs with explosives under the tanks. This isn't war. It's some kind of Asiatic barbarism. The crews are on edge. Every dog running across a field draws fire from all machine guns." For the German soldier, raised on the idea of technological superiority and a clean, chivalrous war, this was a shock. Disgust mingled with the forced necessity of being constantly on alert. It was unfair. It was wrong. It was the weapon of savages. But it worked. And in the Soviet trenches, they could feel this fear. They saw how the German tanks began to move more cautiously, how they started to probe the road ahead with machine gun fire, how the infantry accompanying the tanks now walked ahead, burning out all suspicious cover with flamethrowers. The psychological effect proved to be no less than the physical damage. Every vehicle destroyed by a dog cost the Germans not only steel, but also their nerve. Every German tanker now knew, in any Russian forest, in any Russian village, he might be met not only by a 45mm gun in an ambush, but also by a small, fast, inescapable death running on 4 legs. The weapon of desperation had begun to inspire fear. The winter of 41, the approaches to Moscow, snow, deep and heavy, hid the wounds of the earth, but it couldn't hide the cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and bound not only metal, but human will. The German tank armada, exhausted but still mighty, was making a final, desperate effort to break through to the heart of the capital. On one such front, at an unnamed railroad junction, the defense was held by a battalion with almost no anti-tank weapons left. Anti-tank rifles were powerless against the frontal armor of the panzers. Their artillery had been knocked out in previous battles. All they had were rifles, grenades, and an attached special detachment of destroyer dogs. The last hope, the weapon of last resort. The battalion commander looked through his binoculars at the approaching avalanche. 12, 13. He lost count. 24 steel boxes crawled across the virgin snow, and it seemed nothing could stop them. He turned to the commander of the dog handler detachment, a young lieutenant with frost-bitten cheeks. "Prepare them," he threw out curtly. And in that word, there was neither faith nor enthusiasm, only the cold determination to use everything they had. The dogs were released in waves, 4 at a time, then 5. They burst from shallow snow trenches, almost invisible against the white background. Black dots, rushing swiftly towards their fate. The Germans spotted them almost immediately. The bow machine guns chattered, kicking up fountains of snow. The first dog fell, the second, the third, but the fourth broke through. A muffled thud under the belly of the lead tank. The vehicle lurched, smoke poured from it, and it spun clumsily in place, tearing one of its tracks. For a moment, the attack faltered, and then the second wave went. Again, the gunfire, again, the losses, and again, a success. Another tank froze, listing to one side. Panic is a contagious thing. The German tank crews, seeing their comrades blown up from below, began to get nervous. They fired erratically, afraid to get closer. They didn't understand where the strike would come from. That day, on this sector of the front, the German tank attack was stopped. In the evening, when the battle subsided and a frosty moon rose over the field littered with burning husks, the battalion commander wrote a report to headquarters. His hand, in a frozen glove, struggled to form the letters on the paper. He didn't write about heroism or feats of valor. The text was dry and businesslike, like a weather report. In the course of fierce fighting, the forces of the attached destroyer dog unit managed to halt the enemy's advance. 12 enemy tanks were destroyed, thwarting the attack and causing panic in the enemy ranks. Losses among the dogs and handlers, 100%. 100%. That meant not a single dog returned. Not one of those young men who brought them here survived. They had released their charges under a hail of fire until the very end. The price of this success was absolute. But at headquarters, and later in Moscow, these dry lines turned into a legend. The newspaper Pravda came out with a stunning headline: "Faithful four-legged friends and heroes stand tall to defend the motherland." The propaganda machine went into full gear. The story of the dogs that stopped a tank armada spread to all fronts, acquiring new, incredible details. It became a symbol of resilience, an example that the enemy could and should be beaten by any means necessary. A feat born of desperation was transformed into a bright poster, inspiring soldiers to new achievements. And in the German headquarters, this incident was recorded in the combat log as an unfortunate setback. In this sector, the attack was thwarted by the enemy's use of unconventional weapons. Losses are unpleasant, but not critical. They didn't see a triumph in this. They saw only another manifestation of the irrational, fanatical stubbornness of the Russians, which they had to reckon with. Thus, the forced triumph was born. A victory paid for with such a price that it was easier to speak of it in the language of posters than to recall its true face. A victory as bitter as the smoke over the snow-covered field, strewn with the bodies of heroes who didn't even have names. For the staff officer, it was a line in a report. For the propagandist, a headline in a newspaper. For the German tanker, a moment of icy terror. But for one man, frozen in a trench, it was the moment of truth, a moment that stretched into eternity. For the handler, there he is, sitting, pressed into the frozen earth. Beside him is his dog, his friend, his weapon. He can feel the warm body trembling under his hand. From the cold or from fear, it's impossible to tell anymore. A roar fills his ears. Engines roar, metal roars. People scream. The whole world has become one continuous deafening howl. He sees the target. The black cross on the gray armor is slowly crawling right at them. 150 meters. 100. The time has come. His fingers, numb with cold, find the cold metal ring, the safety pin. He pulls it. The click is almost inaudible in the general din, but to him, it sounds louder than a gunshot. That's it. The mechanism is armed. Now his friend is 12 kilograms of TNT, ready to explode at the slightest touch. He leans close to the dog's ear, his lips whispering the last words. What were they? No one will ever know. Maybe words of encouragement, maybe words of forgiveness, or maybe just a name. And then comes the command. That one. Short, sharp, terrible in its ordinariness. Release! And the dog runs. In that instant, the handler's world narrows to a single point, to a small, dark figure racing across the snowy field. He watches it go, and he prays, but for what? What does a man pray for when he has sent his only friend to certain death? That it makes it? Yes, of course. That it isn't cut down by a machine gun burst. That it carries out its order. That its sacrifice is not in vain. That the tank crawling toward his trench turns into a pile of smoking metal. That he and his comrades stay alive. He prays for success, for victory. But at the very same moment, another prayer, desperate and hopeless, tears itself from the depths of his soul. That it doesn't make it. That a miracle happens. That the enemy tank swerves. That it gets hit by a cannon a second before. That the dog gets scared and comes back. No, not comes back. That it just runs away into the woods, into the field, anywhere, far away from this hell. That it survives. Please, let it survive. Two mutually exclusive prayers tear his consciousness apart. Both mean death. The mission's success is its death. Failure is, possibly, his own. He watches, unable to look away, at this terrible race against time and fate. And in the steel box hurtling toward him, a German machine gunner sees a small, fast target in his sights. To him, it's not a friend, not a living being. It's just a threat. Number 16 in the directive on Hundeminen. He calmly, methodically traverses the barrel, catching it in his crosshairs. He squeezes the trigger. And in that moment, in the very same second, 3 people in different parts of the battlefield are asking God for completely different things. The handler is praying for a miracle. The German machine gunner for a clean hit, and the commander in the trench for an explosion. Anna Somova, one of the few surviving trainers, would speak of this decades later in an interview. Her voice would be quiet, cracked. The most terrible thing was the command release. You pull the pin, slap the dog on the back, and it runs. And you watch it go. And you pray. You just don't know for what, that it makes it or that it doesn't. Either way, it's death. It was a prayer without hope, a prayer in which any answer was a tragedy, and it was repeated hundreds, thousands of times on the endless fields of the most terrible war in human history. July 1943, the Kursk salient. The air melts from the heat and hatred. The earth has turned into a black, metal-scarred hell. The greatest tank battle in human history has reached its apex. Here, on these fields, the fate of the war was being decided. And here, in this hell, a weapon of desperation was about to have its final, loudest say. On one of the flanks of the Voronezh front, in the sector of the 6th Guards Army, German Tigers and Panthers were trying to break through the defenses. They had already passed the first line of trenches, crushed the artillery batteries, and were now steamrolling the second. It seemed nothing could stop this river of steel. But the Soviet command had prepared a surprise. While the main forces held back the frontal assault, on the flank of the attacking group, a special detachment lay in wait, hidden in the dense rye and hastily dug revetments. 160 dogs, the last reserve, the final argument. The German tankers of the Wehrmacht's 12th Panzer Division were confident. They could already taste victory. The Russian anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of their new machines. They pressed forward, firing on the move, meeting almost no resistance. And then, the ground came alive. This was not like the previous attacks. The dogs didn't run in sparse, single waves. They surged forward all at once, from dozens of different points, dozens of small, swift, silent deaths. They raced across the field, hugging the ground, disappearing into the tall grass and smoke. The crew of the lead Tiger spotted them too late. The machine gunner opened fire, but the targets were too numerous, too fast. While he tried to catch one in his sights, 3 others were already slipping through the dead zone. The first explosion, a second, a third. They weren't as powerful as aerial bombs, but they were fatal. One Tiger froze, its track torn apart. A Panther next to it nosedived, hit beneath the engine compartment. Another tank spun in place, engulfed in flames. Panicked shouts erupted over the radio. Hundeminnen! Hundeminnen überall! Mine dogs. They're everywhere. The attack, so confident just a moment ago, faltered. The tankers, locked in their steel coffins, were trapped. They couldn't take aimed shots at targets that were too close, too low. They watched as these shadows dived under neighboring vehicles and shuddered, waiting for the impact. Some crews began to reverse, trying to get out of the kill zone. Others simply stopped, spraying fire all around them, hoping to drive off the unseen threat. The formation broke. Order was lost. The breakthrough was stopped dead. That day, in this sector, the 12th Panzer Division lost 12 machines. 12 of the newest, most powerful tanks, the pride of the Panzerwaffe. They weren't stopped by guns, or planes, or minefields. They were stopped by a weapon they despised, a weapon born of hunger, fear, and the desperate ingenuity of soldiers. The commander of the 6th Guards Army, upon receiving the report, gave a short nod. Objective achieved. The tank breakthrough on the flank has been stopped. The price is high, but it is justified by the result. 16 dogs and their handlers did their duty. Meanwhile, the German general, looking at his map and listening to reports from the front, could not hide his fury. "We've lost a dozen machines to some kind of savagery," he yelled into the phone. "The Russians don't fight by the rules. Their fanaticism is irrational." He was right. This was not a war fought by the rules. This was a war for survival. This was the peak, the apogee, the moment of highest, bloodiest effectiveness for the anti-tank dogs, a triumph of desperation, achieved on the scorched fields near Kursk. After this, their role would begin to decline. New, more advanced weapons would appear. But on that July day, in the smoke and thunder of the greatest battle, the final word belonged to them, to the small, nameless heroes whose only feat was to reach their target. And so this story ends, a story of how, in the crucible of total war, the highest virtue, loyalty, was twisted into a deadly mechanism. This is a tale not so much about a forgotten weapon, but about that terrible line, beyond which a person, in the name of survival, is willing to sacrifice the very essence of their humanity. And the main question it leaves behind still resonates today. Where is the line between the necessary cruelty required for victory and the betrayal that leaves a permanent scar on the victor's soul? Was such a victory worth such a price? This discussion is a part of our shared memory. Share your thoughts in the comments, because it is in this kind of dialogue that history ceases to be a mere collection of facts and acquires meaning. If you find these difficult topics important, please support us with a like and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss the continuation of our explorations into the deepest and most controversial pages of the past.